Not mere works of art, but it's purely works of art. Okay, it's the top of the hour. Let's go. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen? All right. Picture with me, if you will. You are now all archaeologists. Congratulations. You begin your career, and you are sent on an archaeological dig in Greece. And you're digging in the dirt, somewhere in Greece, and you happen upon this. All right? And nearby you find other things that are of sort of similar metallurgical quality, things that look like spears and knives and longer blades like swords. You find things that look like breastplates and metal shoes. Now, in this archaeological dig, you've not found anything which looks like tools that might be used for, say, agriculture or industry. You've not found any plows or hoes. You've not found any manufacturing machinery. So all you find are armor and weapons of warfare. What sort of inferences are you going to draw about the people who left these artifacts behind? Who were they? What did they do? How did they live? How did they eat? How did they get along with their neighbors?
That they were just warriors for the most part. They lived to fight.
That they were a warrior people. Their culture was built around fighting. Okay? If they're fighting all the time, if they're not engaged in agriculture or industry, how do they eat? How do they feed their children? Take it from other people. What sort of neighbors do you think these people made? Would you have liked to live next to this town? Probably would not have gone well for you. It would have created incentives for you to do what? Leave or join. Yeah. This is a society which seems to have been committed to martial virtues, right? This is the inferences we're drawing. Now, it may turn out that all these inferences are mistaken. But are these fairly rational inferences to draw about these people? Yeah. By the way, where would you find something like this? Sparta! This is Sparta! Yes. Okay, now you're on another archaeological dig elsewhere in Greece. On this new site, you find very few weapons, almost none. The few weapons you do find are the weapons you might expect to be used for hunting. Sort of short-handled knives, bows and arrows. You find a lot of tools that are curious when you first find them. You find tools that look like small hammers and chisels. And you're trying to puzzle through what these tools might have been used for until you suddenly happen upon this. And this, let's suppose, is standing slightly toppled in an area that has been leveled flat with tall marble columns all around it. What sort of inferences are you going to draw about the people who left this behind? Were they the same as the Spartans?
I would say more civilized culture.
More civilized. More civilized in what sense?
That they didn't have fighting tools, they had working tools. They had things to grind metals with.
Their tools are not tools for death, destruction, and domination. Their tools are tools for what sort of work?
Cultivation, making art.
Learning, making art. In particular, this kind of art. Could you do this, by the way? Anybody here could do this? No? Me neither. What do you suppose is necessary to produce a people who can produce this?
Peace. Security.
They have to have peace and security.
Education.
They have to have some sort of education. They have to have institutions in their society that are devoted to what?
Art. Order.
To the cultivation of beauty and art and aesthetics. To the discipline of stonework. How many of you have ever tried to carve something out of marble? Is it easy? No, you probably have to teach people how to do that, right? What do you suppose is being taught in the school in Sparta? What are they teaching their kids how to do?
Fight.
Fight, right? Rational inference from the artifacts they left behind, right? What do you suppose they're teaching the kids in school here? How to sculpt, how to sketch and draw, how to observe, right? To sculpt this, you have to begin with very careful observations, don't you? About the female human figure. Notice off the back of this figure, the sprouting wings. How many of you ladies folded up your wings on the way into class this morning? Okay, all right. Fair enough. You can reveal them to us later if you feel so comfortable. Where did this idea of wings on a female figure come from? Do you see these walking around most places? There's probably some sort of mythology going on here, don't you think? This is probably a culture that also tells stories and cultivates the telling of stories and values storytelling. There's probably some sort of culture of literature being passed on in this place. By the way, who knows what place this came from?
Nike, the winged goddess of victory, from Athens.
This is close, not Athens. It is winged victory. This particular winged victory, which is now at the Louvre in Paris, came from where? Anybody know? Samothrace. If you ever go to the Louvre, be sure to see the winged victory of Samothrace. Everyone will be crowded around the Mona Lisa. Just skip the Mona Lisa. Go see this. Okay. Now, you travel to a new archaeological site. All right? This new archaeological site is on the North American continent. The year is 2500 AD, almost half a millennium from now. As you dig down into the ruined remnants of this lost civilization, you uncover this. What inferences are you going to draw about the people who left this behind? Superficial. What do you mean by that?
They care about material objects.
They care about material objects. Well, these people care about material objects. It takes a lot of work to carve this out of stone, doesn't it?
They care about how they represent themselves to other people.
They care about representation. The people in Samothrace care about representation. The physical objects are a means to tell stories and to make beautiful art. What do you think the physical objects are here for in the society that left this artifact behind?
They had advanced trade and industry.
Trade and industry. You got to have a fairly sophisticated commercial society, don't you? To produce enough goods and services that you need to build an entire mall, which is larger than most ancient Greek villages, in which to sell all the stuff. What about the stuff? What are people using that for? They're using it to tell stories, or to create art, or to conquer nearby civilizations? Are people running in here to buy a spear so they can invade Canada? You don't get the sense that these folks are paying much attention to the martial virtues or to the aesthetic virtues, do you? What sort of virtues are they interested in?
Commercial.
Well, the commercial virtues, trade, commerce, selling and buying, consuming and producing, yeah? That's the inference you might draw about these people, and that would be a fairly reasonable inference. But don't stop there, because just a few miles away, another site that dates to roughly the same time period, you find a building that looks quite different from this one. This building has marble columns and a very tall facade. It looks like it might have belonged in ancient Greece, but you're still on the North American continent. And you start to dig your way into the ruins of this building, and inside what appears to be the entrance or the front hall of this building, you discover this artifact. This artifact has words on it, but you're a very skilled archaeologist, and so you remember your ancient languages like American English, and you're able to read, at the very least, the names on this artifact. A fellow named Martin Luther King Jr. and a fellow named Frederick Douglass. And you notice that they're talking about something that looks awfully familiar, something that Socrates was interested in, and Antigone was interested in. And as we'll see later, Augustine and Aquinas and Cicero and Justinian were interested in. So what inferences do you draw about the people who left this behind? Are you still so sure that they were only interested in commerce? Or they also celebrate other virtues? Now we travel to a site in ancient Babylon where you discover this. What is this? This is the Code of Hammurabi. And so the question we start with today is, what inferences can we draw about the Babylonians by looking at the Code of Hammurabi?
They believed in rules, and they also believed in justice and having consequences to the rules and laws that they set forth.
We infer from this artifact left behind, this stone tablet, which purports to be a code, whatever that means, that they had a strong affinity for rules. Oh, I'm having bad luck with markers. Is this one just, yep, totally dead. They had a strong affinity for rules, and they had a strong affinity for justice, and they thought that somehow these two things were connected. How are they connected? Do you need a code or do you need rules in order to achieve justice? Are there any other ways to order a society?
Maybe through religious views.
Religious adherence. You could have a society where the society was ordered by religious convictions. This is what's known as a theocracy. There have been such societies throughout history, haven't there? We're going to look at one very, very soon. You could have a society where we all adhere to ancient customs, right? We just do what we've always done. These are the things we've always done. We've always done them this way, so we're going to continue to do them. You could have that kind of society. You could have thieves. You could have a society where there's one king who tells you what is just and right to do, and then you do it on penalty of death. Let's consider that one for a moment. Contrast with me, compare and contrast with me for a moment what we learned about Creon's view of justice last class with what we're learning about Hammurabi's view of justice in this class. So think for a moment about Creon's edict and compare it to Hammurabi's code. What's similar and what's different between the two?
Creon's edict was for a specific situation, and Hammurabi's code seems to be not with a specific situation in mind, just overall, not considering what might happen, not what has happened.
Good. So we might, you say, Creon's edict is about a specific situation. We might say Creon's edict is particular, isn't it? Creon's edict is particular to Polynices. Don't bury Polynices. Whereas the rules contained in Hammurabi's code are general, aren't they? They apply to everyone. Or they purport to apply to everyone. What else do you notice?
It's the issue of rex lex versus lex rex. The law is king versus the king is law.
What do you mean by the difference between law is king versus king is law?
In Creon's case, he believes that he has the power to say what is law and what is not.
He makes that claim, doesn't he?
He does.
He says, when challenged, it's my edict, and so it's the law. What is the law? All you have to know is the law's source, me. If it comes from me, it's law. That's Creon's idea of law, isn't it? Is that the same idea of law we get from Hammurabi? First of all, does he claim to act on his own authority? On whose authority is Hammurabi claiming to act? The gods. That's different. Furthermore, Creon's edict is revocable. In fact, at the end of the play, he changes his mind, doesn't he? What has Hammurabi done with his rules? Where has he written them down? In stone. Are they going to change? Nope. If you want to know the rules in Creon's Thebes, what are you going to have to do? Where are you going to have to put yourself? You got to be near the palace, don't you? You got to be hanging out right where the king is. You got to wait patiently to hear what the rules are today, because they might be different than they were yesterday. They might be made up after the fact, as they were in the case of Polynices, right? Creon's edict with respect to Polynices was after Polynices has already committed treason, allegedly, right? Whereas Hammurabi's rules are made in advance. If you do any of these things in the future, any of you, these will be the consequences. And do you have to be standing next to the king to know what the rules are or the judgments are? No, what has he done? He's published them. He's put them on stone. All you have to do is go find the stone. Find a stone near you. Okay, so let's pause for a moment then and notice that something really interesting and important has happened between our visit to Thebes and our visit to Babylon. And that is that the Babylonians have introduced this idea that law can stand apart from the king. It can be its own thing. It can be written in stone. It can be promulgated before the fact. It can even stand apart from the particular judgments of the king. And the Babylonians think this is worthwhile. This is valuable. This is a worthwhile thing to do, to make a legal code and to write it in stone. And this reveals a number of very interesting and important things about the Babylonians. The first thing is that they made things. Like the Spartans, and like the Athenians and other Greeks, and like us, they're leaving behind artifacts. And that's interesting, because artifacts are creations of human reason and action. For all their instrumental intelligence, dolphins and dogs and chimpanzees do not leave behind helmets and breastplates and works of art and plaques. So there's something going on here that the Babylonians are leaving these artifacts behind, suggests that there's something going on here which is creative, which is historically contingent. It might not have happened this way. It could have gone a different way. This is the product of human deliberation and choice and action. That there is such a thing as the rule of law rather than the rule of kings was not inevitable. Some human beings had to choose and act to make it happen. And the fact that they left these particular artifacts behind indicates to us that they thought it was really important that they choose and act in this way. And we can pause and reflect for a moment on what this says about human beings generally. The ancients saw very clearly that human beings are radically different from other animals because we can reflect and choose and act for reasons. We need not always be swept along by emotions and passions and appetites. Rather, we can master our passions and appetites, and we can act reasonably. So, for example, the Roman lawyer and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero remarks on the, quote, creature of foresight, wisdom, variety, keenness, memory, endowed with reason and judgment, which we call man, who alone of all living creatures participates in reason and reflection. He calls this a divine capacity which, when it is developed and become complete, is rightly called wisdom. So we humans have the ability to transcend the present moment and our own immediate selfish desires and appetites to think about what is good not just for me now, but for me in the future, and you in the future, and all of us together. And how do we want to get there? And maybe making law is a good way to get us to that state of affairs that we want to reach. Call it justice. Another thing we can learn about the Babylonians from this is that they didn't spend all their time thinking about how to make money or conquer their enemies or get really good barbecued eagle. Right? They thought about law, and it seems they thought about it quite a lot. They certainly followed many ancient customs. You get that sense from the prologue. For example, they worship gods and goddesses. They make sacrifices. They're arranging the marriages of their sons and daughters. They're brewing beer. But they also chose intentionally, deliberately, through reason, to change some customs, to prohibit some things that had been allowed, and to allow some things that had been prohibited, to require some things that have been left undetermined, to settle and specify their legal obligations this way rather than that way. And so, recall the reading that we ended with last time from Lewis's Mere Christianity. Lewis refers to this standard of behavior that we humans are capable of knowing. We're capable of knowing and we're capable of declaring the difference between right and wrong. So Lewis observes that quarrels are really arguments. Just like the argument that Ismene makes to Antigone, the argument that Crito makes to Socrates, and arguments presuppose that there's something to argue about, a right answer and a wrong answer. But arguments also often presuppose that people might disagree. And so in some cases, we find that there's one uniquely right answer. In some cases, we discover that we need more specification. We need someone to say, this is the way we're going to do it. So there are some things, then, that we argue about because we want to know what is the right thing to do. What is the wrong thing to do? If we're not governed by law, Lewis says, then all things we said about the war were nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong, unless right is a real thing which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had no notion of what we mean by right, then though we might still have had to fight them, we could no more blame them for that than the color of their hair. But then there are other things about which we might reasonably disagree. If I kill your ox accidentally, should I have to pay as much as I would pay if I killed it intentionally? Reasonable minds might disagree. We're going to get a very specific answer to that question, aren't we? In the code. So there are some things for which law provides the answer and tells us what is right and wrong to do. Now, Hammurabi suggests that law is somehow connected to this idea of right and wrong. It's a very moralistic enterprise Hammurabi considers himself set out upon. So just look at the preamble here with me. And notice all of the legal terms in the preamble. And notice all of the moral or evaluative terms in the preamble. And notice how they're mixed up with each other. So you see legal terms. We see decree. We see assignment. We see dominion. We see kingdom. We see rule. We also see a lot of evaluative terms. We see great, illustrious, exalted, feared God, righteousness, wicked, evildoers, strong, harm, weak, enlightened, well-being. And so there's this very strong connection that Hammurabi wants us to make between his law and what is good and right. Somehow these two things are supposed to be very intimately tied up with each other. Okay, any questions about any of that so far? Okay, let's look at particular laws. We'll begin with laws 1 and 2. All right. Now, suppose you're on another archaeological dig. You're in the area of the Sinai Peninsula, and as you're digging, you uncover these. You'll be shocked to know that this is not the original. Those were unavailable. They've been they're on loan actually. To the White House, I think. I don't know what he plans to do. Any similarities or differences between the Ten Commandments and Hammurabi's code? What do you notice?
They both invoke divine authority.
They both invoke divine authority. Neither Moses nor Hammurabi claims to be making law on his own authority, does he? Both claim to be making law, either making law, in the case of Hammurabi, on the authority of the gods, or in Moses' case, communicating directly law that's been handed down by God himself.
They also carry on the respect of the guardians of mother and father to keep the tradition and stuff.
Packed into them is piety for your parents. Yeah? That's interesting. We're not going to just let this thing run on autopilot. In both cases, there's express provision made for piety toward your parents.
They're both written in stone, so no plan to change.
They're both written in stone, so there's no plan to change. In fact, it suggests that change is not possible. And what does this suggest? Remember, we said the fact that Hammurabi's code is written in stone suggests that Hammurabi, unlike Creon, is not a lawgiver who changes his mind. Right? Once he's made up his mind, he's made up his mind. You ain't going to change it. And what does this suggest about the God of Israel? Are the people of Israel supposed to conceive of their God as an arbitrary, whimsical God like the gods of Greece or Rome? No, this is supposed to be a God who, once he's made up his mind, he's not going to change it. What else do we notice?
The Ten Commandments does not establish, can you hear me? Okay, it does not establish consequences.
It doesn't give us consequences. Isn't that interesting? We don't have fee shifting provisions. We don't have evidentiary rules. We don't really have much of anything, do we? We have some general directives. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. What's to be done in the case of an adultery? Now, later, Moses is going to give the people very particular Levitical rules which do set out particular penalties and particular procedures and so forth for adjudication. But the Ten Commandments themselves, the stone tablets that come directly from God, they don't deal with any of that, do they? It's almost as if God expects the people to keep them. That's interesting. What else do we notice?
There are a lot fewer.
A lot fewer. There aren't hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, there are only 10. In a couple of classes, we're going to meet a guy who claimed to be related to the God of Israel, who's going to boil them down to 2. They're going to get really simple. What else do we notice?
This rule is from one God, and I think the code was more than one.
There are quite a family of gods in Babylon,
Yeah.
aren't there? Yeah. This is only one God. So we don't have to worry about the gods fighting with each other or disagreeing with each other.
Well, God originally wrote the first 10 Commandments. Hammurabi probably wrote it down by himself, or legal scholars.
That's the claim, isn't it? Moses is making the claim that these commandments come directly from God himself. These are not my specifications. This is directly from God himself. Okay. A few things just to observe about this God of Israel. A few additional things that we don't get from the stone tablets, but we do get from the testimony of the Hebrew Scriptures writ large. Most of you have probably heard this stuff before, so it'll just be a very brief review. Some of you, it might be news. But Moses, in Deuteronomy 4, begins by reminding the people about who this God of theirs is, and particularly what he has done. The most recent thing that he's done is he has freed them from slavery. So they were under someone's power and authority and rule very recently. That someone was Pharaoh. And Pharaoh ruled them completely arbitrarily. They were slaves. They had no legal or moral agency at all. Moses is reminding them God has freed you from slavery, and his law now presupposes that you have moral agency. It's yours now to choose to obey the rules or not. The other thing that's interesting that Moses reminds them is that they have heard God's voice. Why would it be significant to the people of Israel that they have heard God's voice? Well, the people of Israel know a particular account of creation, which has been handed down to them. They know very well the story of creation in the Hebrew tradition. And in that story, the voice of God is not like other voices. God does not merely use his voice to communicate propositions. When the God of the Hebrew people speaks, according to this story, he uses his voice to bring things into existence. Often bringing things into existence out of nothing. When was the last time you tried to make something out of nothing? You can make something out of something. Try making something out of nothing. That's the claim. Good things, like trees and animals and even human beings. So here's the beginning of the creation story from the Hebrew Bible, and listen for legal and evaluative words in it. Compare it to the preamble from Hammurabi's Code. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Then there are several other days in this creation story. And then toward the end of the creation story, we get this. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them have dominion. We're looking for legal terms and evaluative terms. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on earth. Time out. What is the very first commandment? Is it Shema, O Israel? No, the very first commandment God gives long before Israel is born. Be fruitful and multiply and have dominion. Whatever that means. We're going to have to unpack that. But that's the first commandment. That's the first law. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was not just good, very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Now, you're an Israelite in the desert. Moses brings you these tablets, and he says, remember, your God delivered you from slavery, and you've heard his voice, and he's about to give you law. What are you thinking? You're thinking, based on the creation story, that when God gives you law, he also gives you good gifts, very good gifts. He tells you they're yours, have dominion over them. There's an inherent connection in the Hebrew story between God giving good things to his people and giving them a law to sustain those good things, to cultivate them and care for them and have dominion over them and to make them flourish. So when Moses says to the people, God's about to give you this land, flowing with milk and honey, with lots of very good things, and all he wants you to do in exchange is do what? Obey the law. There's an inherent connection between obedience to the law and getting good things from God in this land, the garden, or Canaan, where God is placing it. Okay, so that's the background to the story that we encounter here in Deuteronomy. Yeah? Most of you have heard that story before, I trust? Not news to most of you? Okay, good. Here's the first question. If the story is true, I recognize there are a lot of people who think it's not true. Fine. But suppose it's true. Put yourself in the shoes of the Hebrew people who believe that it's true. Do they have a sufficient reason to obey this God? Seems plausible, doesn't it? Now, ask yourself about someone who doesn't believe it's true. Richard Dawkins. Does he have a sufficient reason to keep the Ten Commandments? I see no's and I see yeses. Where are my no's?
It's from his perspective, it's a logical fallacy because it's an appeal to an authority.
It's an appeal to authority. I don't believe in this God. So you appealing to his authority for these commandments doesn't do anything to impress me. That's the argument for no, right? Is there an argument for yes?
If we go by the Bible says in Romans chapter 2 that God has written his law upon the hearts of every man. So everybody knows the laws of God, like to not lie, to not steal, which is why we feel bad when we do those things. So he has to obey them, even though he chooses to not say it's from God.
So the authority of the rules might stand on the authority of God, if you believe in such a thing. or it might stand on the authority of the rules themselves. We're going to meet a couple of thinkers, St. Paul, who you just quoted, and another one named Thomas Aquinas, and another one whose name we saw earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to make just that claim. The authority of this higher law stands on its own authority. You know it to be true. The basic principles, in fact, are self-evident to you. That's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. But if it's the case that this law is a way of sustaining good things, like order and cultivation of fruitful trees and fisheries and environmental protection, right? Do you have to believe in God to come to the conclusion that these rules are good to obey? You don't, do you? In other words, the Israelite people now have two reasons to think that they ought to pay attention to what Moses is about to tell them. One is, they believe that they have a personal God who created all that there is and who's rescued them from slavery, and that when he gives you a law, he's also giving you something good that he wants you to preserve and have dominion over. They also know that these good things are going to require some work. And so the law is a way of telling us what we need to do to sustain it. There are a lot of people still today who believe, whether or not they believe in the particular God of the Hebrew Scriptures, that the ordered complexity of the world around us suggests that the world is a creation of a personal, intelligent designer. A lot of people believe that today. And so they argue one can reason to the existence of God from what we can observe in the material dimensions of time and space. So, for example, if human reason is not designed by an even more intelligent being, then how did it come to be? In other words, the amazing thing isn't that we meet stupid, vicious, and lazy people. That's not amazing. The amazing thing isn't that there's chaos and disorder. The amazing thing is that we meet intelligent, virtuous, and active people who are able to bring order about in the world. And that requires an explanation. How did these human beings who are capable of doing these incredible things come into being? Now, notice all of the pagan thinkers that we've encountered so far also believed this. They didn't all agree on whether there was one God or many gods. They didn't all agree on what God does for a living. But they all presupposed that there was a rational designer to the design. And so one reason people have had throughout history to seek out and obey God's commands is that the same God who speaks those commands speaks all things into existence, including me. And so I better pay attention to what he says. The interesting thing about the Hebrew God is that he's not part of the four dimensions of time and space. He's outside of it, he precedes it. He created it. And he commands his people not to worship created things. What we get here is a very sharp distinction between creator and created. And you're not to worship the created things, the God tells the Hebrews. Rocks, sticks, Baal, the golden calf, Facebook, Ford F-150s, Alabama football, right? Those, it is suggested to the Hebrew people, are not true sources of life. Their existence is derivative, just like us. Only God can create what is very good, new life. And so he says those who listen and obey him will have what? Life. And those who disobey, Moses says, will have what? Death. So this God doesn't need to impose external sanctions. The sanctions and penalties are built into the law itself. The suggestion is that if you follow the Ten Commandments, things will tend to go well. Not always, not a perfect correlation, but things will tend to go well for you, your children, your tribe, your community. And if you don't, what's going to happen? You're going to die. Pretty straightforward choice. Okay, let's take a look at some of the particular verses here. And I want to focus your attention right now on verses 4 and 5. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes. Let's just read the first paragraph. Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them that you may live. Notice the connection between obedience and life. And go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take from it. Remember, the rule is unchanging. This is it. Not going to change. That you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor, for the Lord your God destroyed from among you all the men who followed the Baal of Peor. Now, who knows anything about the Canaan gods, Baal and Asherah? What did they require of the people who worshiped them? What kind of sacrifice? Yeah. Really small human beings. All right, we know this from archaeological evidence, that the Canaanites sacrificed their babies on the altars of Baal and Asherah. Notice the strong connection between the other gods and death. And this God is reversing it. Don't go worshiping those gods, because what they require of you is death. What I'm offering to you is life. It's a consistent theme throughout. Okay, so what do you have to do to get this life? But you who held fast to the Lord your God are what? All alive today. So he's appealing to their history. Remember, they've just been rescued from slavery, where, according to the story, the firstborn sons of all of Egypt were what? And the firstborn sons of all the Hebrew people who obeyed God's command to put blood over the door were what? Alive, saved. The Red Sea, the plagues, the whole bit, right? Strong correlation here. See, I have taught you statutes and rules that the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Think back to Socrates. Does Socrates want to put his practical question to a majority vote? No. Why not? Does he think the majority of Athenians have wisdom? No. He wants to consult whom? His friends, whom he knows to be wise and knowledgeable. What is Moses claiming on behalf of God? Whom should the Israelite people consult for their practical questions? God. Why? Because he has wisdom and understanding. And he's promising to impart those to you. Okay. Now, that's all well and good. The Israelites are following Moses in the desert. But what about everyone who comes after them? Are they all out of luck? You were born too late? Too bad, no wisdom for you? Or does Moses make provision for those people as well? What kind of provision? Anyone pick up on this? What's supposed to happen after Sinai?
You teach your children what God did for you, and then they'll continue the tradition of telling their children.
Just like in Babylon. Teach your children to respect you so that they will take seriously when you teach them the law. And why do you do that? So that they will live in the land that God's commanded you. All right, we skip ahead to Deuteronomy 5, and we find the laws themselves. And Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face in the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at that time. to declare to you the word of the Lord. Remember, they're hearing his voice. According to their convictions, it's the same voice that speaks everything into existence, including all life. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain. He said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. First commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that it is earth beneath, or it is in the water under the earth. Why? Those are created things. They can't give life. I created them. So don't worship them. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. And you shall not cover your neighbor's wife, or desire his house, his field, his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything else that is his neighbor's. Catch-all clauses become a favorite in codes you'll discover in law school. Okay. A couple observations about this. Are there a lot of exceptions to these rules? Do you see exemptions or escape clauses or qualifications here? When is it acceptable to commit adultery? When is it acceptable to bear false witness against your neighbor? Never. How easy is it going to be for the people of Israel to keep these rules? Not very. And for those of you who have read ahead in the story, maybe in Sunday school or on your own time for your amusement, you know that the story doesn't end well eventually. But are the people of Israel all that different from us? Have you ever done anything you regret? Raise your hand if you've never had any regrets. I want to know what your secret is. Is it possible to live this way, in obedience to all these 10 commandments at all times throughout one's entire life? Or maybe we need something more. Even assuming the story is true, we need something more. But we'll come back to that question in 2 classes from now. But finally, to close today, I want to look at the Uniform Commercial Code. Reading through the Uniform Commercial Code, what did you notice? Especially comparing it to Hammurabi's code and the code which Moses brings down from Mount Sinai. Just some general observations.
We have definitions.
We have definitions. What do you mean by definitions?
Like in part 2 here, they're saying contract is distinguished from agreement and things like that.
It's very technical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are the 10 Commandments technical? Do you have to explain the concept of terms of art to someone before they can comprehend the 10 Commandments? No. We need to know something more about what a contract is before we can understand the Uniform Commercial Code. Uniform Commercial Code is going to help us. But we need to understand the technical aspects of the Commercial Code before we can understand what the rules are.
There's no divinity in this.
There's no invocation of divine authority here, is there? What's happened to the idea that codes either come from God or come from God's delegated agent by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century? Gone. Where does the code come from then? From us. We'll get to that in a few weeks when we get to the preamble of the United States Constitution. So something relatively dramatic has happened, hasn't it? Where's the law coming from? It's coming from us. How is it administered? In a very technical way. You have to understand particular definitions of particular terms and how they fit together with other terms. What else do you notice?
Provisions.
What does that mean, provisions?
So, like, let's say there's going to be additions, like there's rules, like you can't murder someone. They say except for someone breaks in your house or something like that.
Okay, so the Uniform Commercial Code doesn't contain nearly as many general commands, does it? What is it mostly concerned with? Is it directed as a set of propositional commands of the general population? Who's the most likely audience reading the Commercial Code? Businesses and their lawyers. And the judges to whom the lawyers are going to make arguments, right? It's a very particular subset of society, isn't it? code is directed at people who are interested in engaging in commerce, and it's written in terms that are going to require them to consult professionals who understand the significance of legal terms of art. It's become very specialized, hasn't it? Hammurabi's code is supposed to be put up in a square so that everyone, if they want to know what the rules are, can go and read it. Everyone. Is that the case with the Uniform Commercial Code? Now we have a very highly specialized profession, called the lawyers, whose job it is to administer the law on behalf of those who are not as specialized or educated. Is that an advance on Babylon, or is that a regression? I'll leave that to you. What else do you notice?
There are distinct definitions in the code that are not provided in the commandments or Hammurabi's code.
Okay, so we've noticed that we have a lot of definitions, and that the definitions are necessary because some of these terms have very particular meanings, don't they? We need to know what the particular meanings are because they're not all self-explanatory. What else?
Maybe they're classified a little bit better instead of just spread out. Like, we had the first guy. His was like, one was a trial by evidence, the second one was a trial by water, the third one trial by evidence. Kind of mixed together. This one seems to be grouped into certain spots what it needs to be to better be understood.
There was a logic to the chronology of Hammurabi's code, wasn't there? Yeah. But there's a very precise logic here, isn't there? There's a very precise and carefully planned out structure and architecture of the Uniform Commercial Code and grouping it.
For more understanding of law, rights, and each other, see my new book, The Age of Selfies, Reasoning About Rights When the Stakes Are Personal. And visit my website, www.adamjmcleod.com.